In 1971, President Nixon did something that hadn't been done in American history. He closed the gold window. Overnight, the dollar went from being backed by gold to being backed by, well, trust. And here's what's wild. That decision didn't just change America's currency. It changed the entire global financial system. But what Nixon didn't tell Americans that night was what happened to ordinary people the last time a major currency lost its dominance. A British schoolteacher in 1950 watched her life savings lose 2/3 of its purchasing power in just 5 years. Not because she made bad choices, because the pound sterling collapsed as a reserve currency. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing three of the same patterns that preceded that collapse. If you want to understand what these historical patterns mean for your money and why the dollar's role in the world might not be as permanent as you think, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Here's something most people don't realize. The dollar has only been the world's dominant reserve currency for about 80 years. That might seem like a long time, but in the grand scheme of currency history, it's actually pretty recent. The British pound held reserve status for over a century before it, the Dutch guilder before that. And here's the pattern that should get your attention. Every single one of them thought their dominance would last forever, right up until it didn't. So what would actually happen if the dollar collapsed? Not in some apocalyptic Hollywood scenario, but based on what history actually shows us, and more importantly, what it meant for regular people just trying to live their lives. That's what we're exploring today. Let me introduce you to someone. Harold Greenberg, factory worker in Manchester, England, 1945. He'd just survived World War II, started a family, saved up $500, equivalent to about $35,000 today. His plan? Retire at 60 with that nest egg supporting him. Seemed reasonable. The British pound was still the world's reserve currency. Britain had won the war. The empire, though weakened, still spanned the globe. By 1955, Harold's $500 could buy less than a third of what it could a decade earlier. His retirement dream? Gone. He worked until he was 68, not because he wanted to, but because his currency had betrayed him. And here's the thing. Harold wasn't reckless. He didn't gamble it away. He simply held his wealth in what everyone told him was the world's safest currency. Quick note before we go further. This video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Always do your own research and consult with qualified professionals before making any financial decisions. Now, you might be thinking, that was Britain after a devastating war. America is different. And you'd be partially right. But the patterns, those are eerily similar. Let's talk about what collapse actually means. Because this is where most people get it wrong. When we talk about a currency collapse, we're not talking about the dollar becoming worthless overnight. What we're really talking about is a loss of confidence that accelerates over time. And that loss of confidence destroys regular people's purchasing power long before the currency technically dies. Take Maria Rodriguez. She's not a historical figure. She's a composite of real people I've researched from Argentina's 2001 currency crisis. Maria was a nurse in Buenos Aires. She had saved 50,000 pesos over 15 years. In early 2001, that was worth $50,000 USD because the peso was pegged 1-to-1 with the dollar. She was planning to buy an apartment. By 2003, her 50,000 pesos was worth less than $13,000. The apartment she'd been saving for? Now completely out of reach. But here's what really gutted her. She'd done everything right. She saved consistently, lived below her means, avoided debt. The system failed her, not the other way around. Here's the crazy part. When the pound was losing its reserve status, most British citizens had no idea it was happening in real time. They went about their daily lives, prices gradually increased, their purchasing power slowly eroded, but there was no single day where everything changed. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Let me show you exactly what this looked like. In 1945, a pound could buy you a week's worth of groceries for a family. By 1950, that same pound bought you maybe 3 days' worth. By 1955, you were lucky to get a day and a half. The currency didn't disappear. People still used pounds. But those pounds were worth less and less of what actually mattered: food, shelter, security. The British government, according to Bank of England historical data, expanded the money supply by over 40% between 1945 and 1950. They had to. They were financing the welfare state, paying war debts, trying to maintain an empire they could no longer afford. Sound familiar? Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The transition from one reserve currency to another follows a remarkably consistent pattern. And it's always ordinary people who pay the price first. Phase 1 is denial. The warning signs are there, but they're dismissed by experts and authorities. The United States, according to the Congressional Budget Office's own projections, is on track to reach a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 180% by 2050. We are running trillion-dollar deficits in years when the economy is supposedly strong. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak in 2022. But here's what that means in human terms. Every dollar the government creates out of thin air dilutes the value of the dollars you're holding. It's not obvious at first. You still see the same number in your bank account. But when you go to buy groceries, fill up your gas tank, pay your rent, that's when you feel it. I spoke with a retired couple in my research. Let's call them Tom and Susan. 24 years later, that $500,000 has the purchasing power of about $340,000 in $2,000. Their careful planning didn't account for persistent inflation eroding their wealth. Now they're cutting back on medications, skipping family visits, eating less meat. This is what slow currency devaluation looks like in real life. Phase 2 is substitution. This is where it gets interesting. Countries and institutions don't abandon a reserve currency overnight. They slowly, quietly diversify. And while they're doing this, regular people are usually the last to know. According to the IMF's own data, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from 73% in 2001 to around 58% by 2024. That might not sound dramatic, but remember, we're talking about trillions of dollars in shifts. China and Russia have reduced their dollar holdings significantly. Saudi Arabia, after 50 years of only selling oil in dollars, has now started accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. But wait, there's something even more important to understand about what this means for you. When the dollar loses its reserve status, Americans lose what economists call exorbitant privilege. Let me translate that into English. Right now, when you buy something made in China, you pay in dollars. China then has to hold those dollars or invest them back in America. This keeps demand for dollars high and prices for you low. Your iPhone, your furniture, your clothes, all cheaper because the world needs dollars. When that changes, let's run the numbers. The U.S. imports about $3 trillion worth of goods annually. If the dollar lost 30% of its value, which is actually modest compared to some historical currency declines, those imports would cost 30% more almost overnight. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average American household spends about $77,000 per year. Research suggests roughly 30-40% of that, either directly or indirectly, involves imported goods. Do the math. That's $23,000, $31,000 of your annual spending suddenly costing 30% more. We're talking about $7,000, $9,000 in reduced purchasing power for the average family in 1 year. Let me paint you a picture of what that actually looks like. You walk into a grocery store. The coffee you usually buy for $8, now $11. The fish you get for family dinner was $15, now $20. Your kid needs new shoes for school. That $60 pair is now $78. None of this is dramatic on its own, but multiply it across everything you buy, every week, every month. It adds up to a fundamentally different standard of living. Jennifer Martinez, another composite from my research of real people who lived through currency crises, was a single mother of 2 in Venezuela. Before their currency collapse, she could afford to feed her kids 3 meals a day, keep them in school, even save a little. She had a professional job as an accountant. By 2018, she was skipping meals so her kids could eat. Her monthly salary couldn't buy what she used to spend in a week. The money was still there. The numbers in her bank account actually got bigger. But those numbers meant nothing. This is what currency collapse looks like when you're living it. Now, let's connect this to what's happening right now, because this isn't just history. We're watching these patterns unfold in real time, and most people have no idea. Central banks worldwide bought over 1,000 tons of gold in 2022 and again in 2023, according to the World Gold Council. That's the highest level in decades. They're not doing this randomly. They're diversifying away from dollars, quietly, strategically. Here's what most people miss. When institutions lose confidence in a currency, they move first. They have the information, the resources, the sophistication. Regular people move last. They're the ones left holding the bag when the music stops. Think about it. When the pound was declining, who diversified into dollars first? The wealthy, the connected, the informed. British workers? They kept getting paid in pounds, saving in pounds, retiring on pounds. By the time they realized what was happening, the damage was done. You might be thinking, if this is so obvious, why isn't everyone talking about it? Great question. And the answer tells you everything you need to know about how these crises unfold. First, it's happening slowly enough that it doesn't make dramatic headlines. Currency gradually loses purchasing power, doesn't get clicks like stock market crashes. But slow motion disasters are often more destructive because people don't react until it's too late. Second, there's enormous incentive for those in power to maintain confidence. The moment people panic, the gradual decline becomes a rapid collapse. So you get reassurances. The dollar is strong. Inflation is transitory. Everything is under control, right up until it's not. I found a quote from a British Treasury official in 1947 that's chilling in its familiarity. The pound remains the bedrock of international finance. Concerns about its status are overblown and ignore Britain's fundamental economic strength. 3 years later, they devalued by 30% overnight. So what would a dollar collapse actually look like for you, specifically based on historical patterns? Let me walk you through it step by step, because understanding this is the difference between being prepared and being blindsided. First, imported goods would become dramatically more expensive. We already covered this, but let's go deeper. It's not just luxury items, medications. Many are manufactured overseas, medical equipment, electronics that your kids need for school, the laptop you work on, even basics like coffee, tea, certain fruits and vegetables, all priced in a global market where your dollars suddenly buy a lot less. Second, interest rates would soar. Why? Because if the world loses confidence in the dollar, the US government would have to offer higher interest rates to convince people to keep lending. The national debt is over $36 trillion. Every percentage point increase means hundreds of billions more in annual interest payments. But here's what that means for you. Your mortgage, your car loan, your credit cards, all would have higher rates if you're trying to borrow. And if you have variable rate debt, those payments are going up whether you like it or not. Meet Robert Chen. He bought a house in 2020 with an adjustable rate mortgage. Payment was $2,400 per month. Seemed manageable. When rates spiked in a crisis scenario, third, and this is the one that really hurts, your savings would lose value, not because you made bad choices, simply because you saved in dollars and dollars are worth less. The number in your account stays the same or even grows with interest, but what that money can actually buy shrinks. Let me give you a framework for how to think about this because it's empowering once you understand it. Reserve currency status isn't a permanent state. It's a privilege that has to be maintained. It requires fiscal discipline, economic strength, political stability, and most importantly, trust. When those elements erode, so does the currency's dominance. So what should you actually watch for? Here are 3 signals that matter, and I'm going to tell you exactly how to track them. First, watch commodity pricing. Oil has been priced in dollars since the 1970s petrodollar agreement. Every barrel of oil sold worldwide created demand for dollars. If that changes, if major oil producers start accepting other currencies as standard, that's massive. We've already seen Saudi Arabia accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. If that spreads, pay attention. How do you track this? Follow oil industry news, watch announcements from OPEC members. It won't be a sudden switch. But if you see multiple countries moving away from a dollar-denominated oil sales, that's your signal. Second, watch what central banks do, not what they say. They're not going to announce, we're losing faith in the dollar, but their actions tell the story. The World Gold Council publishes quarterly reports on central bank gold purchases. If those stay elevated or increase, that's institutions voting with their money against paper currencies. You can check this yourself. World Gold Council website, free data, updated quarterly. If you see sustained high levels of gold buying by central banks, especially by countries that historically held mostly dollars, that's a red flag. Third, watch U.S. fiscal policy. Can the government get spending under control? The Congressional Budget Office publishes long-term fiscal projections. They're not behind a paywall. You can read them yourself. If debt to GDP keeps climbing, if deficits stay above 5% of GDP during economic expansions, if there's no political will to address it, those are your warnings. Here's the empowering part, and why I'm spending 15 minutes of your day on this. Understanding these patterns gives you options. It means you can think differently about how to position yourself. It doesn't mean run out and buy gold tomorrow. It doesn't mean sell all your dollars. It means having a framework for thinking about currency risk, something most Americans never consider because the dollar has been stable for their entire lives. Historical literacy is power. When you know that reserve currencies change, you can prepare. When you know the warning signs, you can adjust before the crowd does. When you understand that this has happened before and will happen again, you're not surprised when it does. I'm not here to tell you the dollar is collapsing tomorrow. No one can predict timing with certainty. What I am telling you is that history shows clear patterns, and many of those patterns are present today. The Dutch guilder was the world's reserve currency in the 1600s, the Spanish real before that, the British pound in the 1800s and early 1900s. Each one seemed permanent. None of them were. And in each case, it was regular people, factory workers, nurses, teachers, retirees, who paid the heaviest price, not because they were foolish, because they trusted a system that changed underneath them. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency since the 1940s. That's 80 years, longer than most reserve currencies in history. Does that mean it's about to end? Not necessarily, but it does mean we should pay attention to the signs and understand what's at stake. What happens if the dollar collapses? Based on history, it wouldn't be an overnight apocalypse. It would be Harold Greenberg watching his retirement vanish. Maria Rodriguez seeing 15 years of savings evaporate. Tom and Susan cutting back on medicine. Jennifer Martinez skipping meals. It would be millions of regular people who did everything right, discovering that the rules changed and nobody told them until it was too late. That's why this matters. That's why you're here. Because being informed is the first step to being prepared. If this changed how you think about the global financial system, you need to check out our video on what happened the last time a major economy tried to abandon the dollar. The story involves assassination plots, frozen bank accounts, and a lesson every American should understand. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We're uncovering these hidden patterns in financial history every week, connecting the dots that most people miss, and telling the human stories behind the numbers. See you in the next one.